There.
You might have to click a button.
Uh, got it.
Okay.
You have
So
my
Lois,
permission.
what have you found?
Well, I found a man actually who was really helpful. His name was Tim Mulligan. And I was really lucky because when I went to the archives in College Park, Maryland, short NARA, but it's the National Archive. I don't know, whatever, but it's referred to as NARA. And they have all the modern military records, including maps, etc. It's a separate building, it's a separate administration for modern military records. And they've got the original records that were brought back after the war. They have videos, they have maps, they have a website that you could spend a day going through. So if you wanted to find your dad, they also have single vet lists, and they they're an entity to themselves because it's army ruled and not Dewey Decimal arranged. So fortunately, now they are digitizing as fast as they can. So you can search records by name and other things. But searching is difficult. So they did have a whole office of archivists. And when you went into research, you would sit down with them and say what you were looking for, and they would give you a roadmap for finding it. And then it's like the Library of Congress. Have you ever gone in
Yeah.
there to?
Haven't been there in person, but I'm on their letters and their newsletters and all that.
Yeah. So in the Library of Congress, you're like the taxpayer queen. You sit at a table and you write down what you want, and then you go to a desk and hand in your request, and then you sit there patiently and wait for your public servants to bring a cart with all your stuff and then lay it out before you as though you were in the finest restaurant. So it's a whole day. It's an adventure, and anybody can go in and do that, or they used to be.
Is this
So
how you found your Normandy Beach identification system?
yes, eventually I found that with the help of archivists because it was wrongly. You can't go into the stacks, is the point. You have to depend on other people to bring back what you order. And the original list that I found was not in the place. What a beautiful mug.
Oh, thank you. A friend made it.
Lovely. Um, it wasn't where it was supposed to be. So one of the fine archivists there went down to try and find it, and they had changed their numbering system at some point, and everything wasn't. So it's when you search in those records, it's really prone to error. It you
Yeah.
have limited time to make requests at NARA. Like if you're there, you put your request in a basket and it's only tended to at certain times.
Oh, right.
And then you have to wait till your stuff comes up, and then you sit down and go through it, and then if you want to print it or take pictures or whatever, it's just not like walking into any library and easily finding something. You need to leave if you came here to go there. You really need to think about adequate time to find what you're looking for.
Like a
um
week to request it and get it. So did you find your father's whole story? It's kind of a
I,
step by step.
finding my father, when when I think about it, occasionally something would come out, and because it was rare and I cared a lot about my father and getting closer to him, if you will,
Mhm. Yeah.
I remember distinctly certain conversations, but it was conversations that were triggered by something, like we'd be sitting watching TV, he would drowse off and then he'd wake up, "Hey, I know that man." Like somebody died, and
Yeah.
he'd say he was my patient in World War II. And then there'd be a short conversation, what was wrong with him. And then, you know 4 years later, something else might happen, and there might be a
Right.
little snippet of
Uh-huh.
something. But he never told me the whole story. And there
Where
was
was he?
something.
Where was he stationed?
He was in. Here's what happened. He was in dental school in 1938. He
Mhm.
graduated, and the government, the War Department, was already alert, big ears to the situation in Europe, and thinking we may have a war on our hands. The world is heating up. Even if we're not in it, we're going to be allied with one side or the other. And they realized they didn't have the medical support staff, because after World War I, they disbanded, and everybody went home, and they weren't thinking about wars. So what they did was the War Department, with the idea of building up at least a base corps for their army support function, that they would go to schools, instead of going to people who were practicing and happy and supporting families. They would try and get the graduating students of medical schools, dental schools, blood tech people, x-ray, respiratory, the whole thing. So they got people who were prominent, like Doolittle, people who were prominent in the 30s, and people would come to hear talk, and they sent these kind of army stars to those schools,
Mm.
nursing, everything. So my dad in 38 went to one of those talks, and thought, he was very patriotic. He was very critical, but he was very patriotic. He was a cynic and patriotic at the same time. So he joined the National Guard at that point.
Okay.
And in the late 30s, they not only were recruiting in that way, but they were having war games, maneuvers, and they sent the National Guard, just like now, the National Guard, they may go for 2 weeks in the summer. Um,
Yeah.
People who are members, they sent them to these war games. So by that time, my parents were thinking of getting married, and they did get married in the late 30s. And my mother followed him wherever he was sent. So he went to North Carolina and Florida and Texas and other places where the National Guard sent him. So he was already set up for the Army before Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
Um,
Hmm.
so uh, he was in the infantry, and they sent him to Fort Lewis in Washington. And then when the war started, they activated him.
And
So,
was he in Europe or in the Pacific?
well, he was in the United States until what they call the buildup. Have you heard the term, the buildup?
Mm-mm.
So towards the end of the war, and they've been talking about this all through the war, they're gonna have to invade the continent. So the military decision was, we will build up our forces in England to the max. And
Mhm.
then from England, that will be the stepping stone. We will invade the continent. And then, you know, it was kind of secret where exactly they would land.
Mhm.
But the plan from, the early 40s was that we will invade the continent after uh, overloading Britain, and then we will have to go east through France to Germany, possibly, and end Hitler's regime. So you'll find a lot of, and your dad wasn't sent over, I noticed, till that same period. Your dad ended in the 40s, in 44. When did he land
Right.
in?
Well, he kind of started in 42. That's when he got his first flight with the Navy.
Right. But
And
here,
then by
that,
40
that was in the States, right?
in the States, right? And then 44, he was in Molesworth, England. So
Yeah,
very close to London, a train ride in for when they
right,
were on leave.
right.
And he took off and got down in 16 missions. Actually, it was the 16th that he was shot down.
Well,
So
you said normally it was 10 missions and home, but he did many more. Is
well,
that
what kind of happened was that he was aiming for getting home, definitely. But they added this new tiny little plane in the summer of 44
yeah,
that protected the plane so they could last longer. And
right,
it's still the same, a lot of flak being shot at you. But
right.
so they moved the flight number up, and they were kind of low
Oh,
on,
right. You mean you're more protected? The odds
a
are more
little
on
bit
your
more
side,
protected.
so we're
Yeah,
gonna keep you in the air
yeah,
longer. Is that?
yeah. So
But
10 flights was an earlier number for like when you get to go home.
right, I remember reading that. But the point is, your dad was part of the buildup. The buildup was sending all our forces to England. And in England, they used to say, "You're going to sink our island. One more truck, and it's we're going to go down." So that if you look in two words, BUILD hyphen UP in Britain, that's what he was part of that buildup, and that was for the goal was in June, D-Day. I mean, so we had apparently we had 1 million troops in England. And some of the people in my dad's unit wrote memoirs. They were very close, and they wrote memoirs after the war, and they write about that landing in England, and then they were put in these camps. World War II camps, so terrible conditions. They were put in these camps when they landed, and then they were distributed over England. And my dad's group in medical was supposed to set up hospitals in England for the wounded in the battles in France. When I was doing this research, it was like a revelation that the army was actually.
You've recently broken up a little bit. I don't know if it was something on the left there that knocked. I'm not sure.
Yeah, there was something about
Okay, now it's clearer.
Bad connection, right?
Okay.
So where in my babble was I disappearing?
Well, he pretty much got it a little garbly, but it was he was stationed then in England in the hospitals there in the barracks for injured out of France.
Yeah, eventually the United States either built hospitals or took over hospitals, and the idea was that they would be ready to receive the wounded from D-Day whenever it happened.
So I haven't filled in that one gap of Dad was trained in the United States, all over the eastern United States, Texas,
Right.
Arkansas, and Glenview in Pennsylvania. But how
Right.
did he actually get to England?
On your dad, my dad?
Yeah. How did were they sent on boat or by plane?
Never planes. I mean,
Okay.
planes had to be brought over and landed, but generally, like my dad was sent around Christmas time at the end of 44, and they landed around, just after New Year, 45.
Oh,
And
yeah, that's about the time my dad. Yeah.
yeah, they were part of the same movement.
Uh-huh.
The buildup.
Uh-huh.
you know, to have the forces ready to go. And one revelation was how methodical the army is. I don't know. I kind of thought, you know, it's like Colin Powell would say, yeah, we're going to have a war. Come on, guys, let's go. But years ahead of time, they had planned this invasion of this, the final act, if you will, this invasion. And there were meetings with Eisenhower and Churchill and Roosevelt in secret places. And so this was all, the revelation was, it's all planned. They're thoughtful. They have these long reports on conditions and weather and any, so your dad and mine were part of this huge movement around the same time. We're going to spring in June. So by, you know, by New Year's, we're going to have our guys in place. We're going to soften them up with planes. You know, we're going to do all the damage we can so that, and so that when we go in with the actual ground forces, with the guys, as much as we can, we're going to make it easier for them, because we're going to do all this destruction and, you know, beat our war breasts and, you know, get it done. So
And
my,
that was a preparation for the D-Day, which is what
yes,
you were writing.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And D-Day is generic. I mean, it's used, we think of it as that one, you know, that one time D-Day,
Mhm.
or D-Day, June 6th, da da da. There were D-Days in Sicily and in Northern Africa before that. So they were, you know, coming across water to land, amphibious landings, and they were sort of practice. I mean, they were necessary steps in the war, but it was sort of practice for amphibious landings in Normandy. You know, that
Oh,
they
okay.
had
Thank you for
lessons.
clarifying that, because I've seen
Yeah,
movies about other D-Days and I'm like, how could there be many D-Days? But there were
yeah,
actually. Yeah, it was part of
debarkation
the
days
D-Day
or what.
plan.
Yeah, yeah. So really, I mean, to be persnickety about it, it should be D-Day Normandy, D-Day Sicily,
Mhm.
D-Day, and then they all had names. Like D-Day Normandy is Operation Neptune.
Uh,
D-Day Sicily was Operation Husky, and D-Day Africa was Operation Torch. So the Army talks in codes too.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
when you're researching, the terms you need to use are all pertinent, especially with these really difficult organizations of library material or archival material. So anyway, there was a book about a German sub. Here's how I found this guy, Tim Mulligan, the one who was the, you know, the World War II archivist king, sort of. There was a book about a German submarine found off the coast of New Jersey after the war recently by divers. And it was near where I lived in New Jersey. And at the, you know, fast forward, they wanted to identify it and find out which number submarine it was. And part of the book talks about that and researching in the archives and finally going to this guy, Tim Mulligan, to have him look at what they think they found, because Tim was the submarine guru and spoke German and wrote the, you know, the protocol for the materials. So I went to the archives and actually met Tim Mulligan, you know.
Oh my gosh, that's
Or,
so great.
and he was an old timer, and he knew that collection, and he knew that you know, where the bodies were in this huge archives building. And when I went there in 2005, the archives, in their federal wisdom, were getting rid of all those old guys. They were trying to, I don't know what they were trying to do. They're trying to rejuvenate it. Whatever happens in big corporations when you want to get rid of the old wood and replace it with new wood. So Tim was sort of out, along with all those experts who I said were available to people who went to the archives and went to the search office and sat down with these guys to plan their research work.
Mhm.
So I was there during that time, and the old guys really knew their stuff, and the young guys were learning their stuff. And I don't know what it's like now. That was around 2005, 2010. Um, so they've been closed or very limited in the last couple of years. So I, I can't
I
say
have been
anything.
online in the NARA search engine.
Okay,
It's
okay.
expansive. I think they've done a lot more digitally than they maybe
Yes,
had
yes, yes,
before.
yes.
And I was really blown away with what I was able to find online. I can't remember now all of what it was, but so the other thing that I found was a book. It's about 45 pounds of
Yeah.
two people whose fathers were on the same force marches that my dad was. They
Okay.
started in Stalag 3,
Yeah.
and then they went to, well, they went straight to 7A, where dad stopped at 13D, where 7A was where the Great Escape happened. And
Right.
then 13D, where dad went,
Yeah.
was where Hogan's Heroes took place.
Okay. Through
And
the movies.
yeah,
Yeah.
and through and
Now,
at
Tim would know all about that. I mean, I can
and
give you his number if you want.
oh yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
at Stalag 13D, that is where there was literally a second lieutenant. Hogan was his name, Robert Hogan. And he said, in this one quote that I found deep in some thread in the internet, that they did have a colonel with a monocle. They did have a sergeant that was kind of goofy like Schultz. And they definitely had a clandestine radio that the colonel allowed them to have because it was the most accurate BBC news, and because everything out of Germany was propaganda.
Right.
So the colonel wanted to hear what was going on because he
Yeah.
couldn't find it with his own German stations. So yeah, I'd love to have that number. That would be great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they all went down to it's a Wehrmacht actually down near Munich. And
Yeah.
that's when what you're talking about, the D-Day happened, the Battle of the Bulge, and Patton's
Right.
Third
Right.
Army liberated them early. And
Right.
mostly because we know at this point, Germany was broke. They couldn't pay for gas or replace
Right.
tires.
Right.
And a lot of that was from the Monuments Men, where they found all the German gold
Right.
and kind of bankrupt the country.
Didn't they, I don't know, hide it in lakes and things like that?
It was in a deep cave that you had to take an elevator down.
Okay.
The cables were all frayed.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower went down into the bottom of this cave, and there was the looting of the museums in Europe. The paintings
Yeah.
were down there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then there were some gruesome boxes or piles of eyeglasses and shoes and things like that.
Right. Right.
Anything that had
I've read
value
that.
that was taken from the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And then like millions and millions of dollars in gold.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that was
That-
all in looking for the art. They found all the values. So
Yeah. I mean, I saw the movie and I've read about it. And the librarian in Paris who helped with locating things, and yeah, so much has come out by dribs and drabs. Did you get his personnel records in St. Louis?
No, I need to do that too. It's
Yeah,
amazing how much, I mean, there's could be definitely a second edition because there's so much information I've gotten even since.
yeah.
And I've
You
tried to
know,
update people like on my blog and newsletter, but it's hard. It's really fascinating how much more I've learned.
right. I learned a lot from, first of all, they had a big fire there. So when people wrote to them, they used to say, sorry, we don't have any records on your person because the fire destroyed them. Well, now they will go back for about, I don't know, it's under $100, but they will go back and restore what they can, because there was a fire and some records were destroyed, but they weren't, not all of them were destroyed completely. And a lot of those, with individual care and people going through the records, they will provide you with the information that was on these old records. Some
And
were
that's,
just smoke damaged. Yeah.
yeah, water damage. That's in St. Louis.
Yeah, it's the place, unless they move them, but it's a place where, when, I don't know about your dad, when my father joined, he had to fill out forms for the army on his hobbies, his
Oh,
relatives, his address, and also they were supposed to have a record of every posting and everywhere each vet went and was. So they were all paper records, and you learn little tidbits from there, about what their lives were like, who was to get their pension if they were killed, and so you learn a lot about that. That, like, one of my father's hobbies was like target shooting or some,
uh, yeah.
so that's, and it's very interesting.
Hmm.
um and they also have what are called morning reports. Every morning, the clerk of the group was supposed to say who was there, who was sick, who was temporarily in a hospital. So there are all sorts of records at Saint Louis, that are,
Okay.
yeah.
Good.
And yeah, and if they say, sorry, honey, we can't fill your request because his records were destroyed, doesn't mean you can get on the phone and talk to somebody there and say, is there anything at all that can be retrieved from what you got? And then they'll go the extra mile, or at least, I'm just talking about my experiences. It could
Mhm.
be very different from you, or now, but that's
You know,
how it went.
you're reminding me about I don't know, 18 months ago or beginning of 2020, I was on this path to go
Right,
into Nara and talk with people and,
right,
from afar. I didn't travel
right,
there.
right.
And it all got shut down. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
boom,
yeah,
gone.
yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
like, well, that's not possible for a while. I had no idea how long it would be. And then
Well,
in the meantime, Aquarius Press said, we'll publish your book. So we put it together with everything that I had.
yeah, you got a
Yeah.
huge amount of detail. It's very concise, but it's packed, your narrative, with information. I mean, there's nothing extraneous or wasted.
Oh,
You know,
thank
you
you.
know,
I
you
take
know.
pride in that.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one. It's very. That's why I have to go back and read it again, because there's just, I took some notes and all that, but there's a lot in there, and you're not talking about uh, sunsets, or it's compact,
Yeah,
concise.
well, it was a very compact period of time, but also I think the scrapbook elements really makes it immediate. And
Did
that's
did
what people have said. I felt like I was there. And I think it's because we're reading like what dad's mother received home and that she probably got together with mom and, that these things were life shattering, little 2 sentence telegrams that came through.
Right, Right.
And it's just, we have such a connection to that, the immediacy of the communication.
So did the things that you had pictures of, like that chaplain's letter, were they in an actual scrapbook? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So the scrapbook, it was on the shelf. We knew it. One time in third grade, Dad started to show it to me. And I asked him, like, we were a third the way through or a quarter of the way through. And I asked him as an 8-year-old, is this like Hogan's Heroes? And little did I know it was like Hogan's Heroes. It was the same camp, but not so funny. And so he closed up the book then and said, yeah, it was kind of like that. Like, I'll never get it. Is kind of what he was saying. I'll never get it.
Yeah.
So, and then the next time he opened the scrapbook was for my son in middle school. He had a friend who was very into World War II. And I thought, this is a way that he's not telling a child.
Right.
And that's what I have heard since. I think we learned that in our Yale for Life class, that these vets will talk to their grandchildren, but not their children about it. And so he sat down and went through that scrapbook in explicit detail. And I was in this period where I videotaped everything. So that is our record of it. And that was the, I'll say, the skeleton of what I wrote. And I had to do a lot of research, including our World War II class, to fill it out.
Yeah. I don't think it's the children, they mellowed too, the vets, because my dad, he would peter out, he'd start to tell me something and then I could see his eyes, they were looking far away, and he was bringing it back to himself. But the thing that opened it up, when the World War II monument opened in Washington, the Library of Congress started a veterans project. Were you part of that at all?
I was very involved with Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, because she was a classmate of mine, and we were friends, and the memorial was just being finished up at the time that I was there. So I do remember the World War II one, and being a sculptor, the kind of pushback they had about glorifying war with people, and they wanted to make sure they didn't have people in the Vietnam one. I do remember that whole discussion.
Well, the sculptor of the World War II monument was a Yale grad. And they had the Yale Club of DC had a day when he led a tour of the monument. Wow. So I went to that, and the World War II, have you seen the World War II monument?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's kind of grandiose and eagles, and the monument itself is very unadorned.
Yeah.
And people were upset about that. So the sculptor was commissioned to make panels of bronze that would be, maybe they were 2 by 6 or something like that, but panels of bronze on a sort of roadway leading into the monument where the pool is and the various battles are mentioned. And those were supposed to be the people. So they were supposed to start with a sort of a fireside scene, where people are listening to Roosevelt talk about the war. So he had to do recreate an interior of 1940, a family listening to a radio. And then it went on, and there's also a field, an airfield, an aviation panel. Are these
It's
things?
been a while since I saw it, but I remember seeing it, and it's triggering some memories. It's been a while. I have family in DC, so usually we get consumed with seeing each other when I'm there.
Yeah,
But we
yeah,
did walk through it several years ago when the kids were young. Yeah.
yeah. Well, he was talking about recreating the details, like what
Yeah.
shoes would a plane mechanic on a South Pacific island be wearing? And
Mhm.
you're an artist. I mean, it wasn't supposed to be impressionistic. It was supposed to be absolutely correct, because there were living people who would remember those things and portray those things like a medical illustrator. I mean, with that kind of accuracy. And he said he and this guy's available. I mean, you could contact him if you wanted to.
Mhm.
He has a studio in the Washington area, unless something's happened to him. But he told about going to the scholars, the Jay Winters, the writers, the retired, and they had no information that was useful to him as an artist illustrating this in relief plaques. And he said, finally, I happened upon the reenactors, the war reenactors, because
Ah.
there's a huge community of World War II reenactors, just as
Mhm.
there are, Civil War reenactors. And he said they are the most, you know, realistic and detail oriented. They could tell you what the grommets on the boots were made of and what color there were, how many there were. And he said, that's who I relied on for the details in the actual war scenes. For the domestic things, he could look in magazines,
Mhm.
but for something like, and he specifically mentioned the aviation one,
Mm.
what the aviation panel, and the 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 drive for soldiers and nurses, and the figures being created, that's really so important to people. I mean, and the names, what Maya Lin did, was just amazing. I mean, it's the most affecting of monuments. But so when the Library of Congress started a veterans collection, and they encouraged people to interview vets like you did with your dad, and to submit the information to them, and they had a whole format. um, so whether you or I or anyone would want to submit something later for the collection there.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea to
Yeah,
because really it's to capture this story that took me a long time to figure out and
right,
have it as a place for someone else to start and find bits of it that helped that their family went through or their father or mother went through.
right. But you can find that online. You just go to Library of Congress Veterans Project and see. What I'm saying is, I don't know if you have to follow their format, but you said you made recordings, etc. So I don't know if they're accepting a personally created format, or if
Mhm.
I don't know. But that's how I started talking to my dad. That was another moment
Oh,
when I could
right.
say, hey dad, they've got this veterans project, and would you want to do it with me? Would that be okay? And he said yes. And things happened so that we didn't do it. But he said, there are things I can tell you now that I couldn't tell you before. And that's because he would talk to his patients and what they were, how they got their wounds and where, and that was important for the care
Mm.
because of what they might have been exposed to or whatever. And he learned things that were secret, that were classified.
Yeah.
And the guys would say, well, I can't tell anybody, and you can't tell anybody this is medical, it's confidential. But I was part of the practice maneuvers in England when we were practicing for D-Day, because they practiced landings. And there was one horrible time when during those practice sessions, uh, Germans came up and fired upon them, and many were killed
Oh,
in the maneuvers, and that's at Slapton Sands, and that wasn't really well known until quite recently.
that was
So
off the England coast.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
off the English coast, and um, one of my dad's patients was got a bullet wound during that, and he confided in my father, and he said, I couldn't talk about that before, but I can talk about it now.
What was it, 30 years they had some kind of code of secrecy, or the
I you
information came
know
out later?
I don't know. It wasn't like the English Secrets Act,
Mhm.
which people are still keeping their
Yeah.
mouths closed because of when you had to sign something. It was just the guy I'm talking about was an engineer, and he wrote a book, and
Oh, okay.
things became more well known. And I don't know if your dad had the same scruples, or if he was under the same pressure to keep certain things secret.
Well, he spent a lot of his European service in POW camps. And
Right.
the thing that kind of informed me the most was, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a 72 series French TV show called the French Village. And in this village, which is I think what he was living with, there was
That
the
was
French.
fiction. That was historical fiction, or
Yeah,
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 I did see that.
yeah. So
Yeah.
you had like the French government and the VC government and the
Right.
Nazis and the
Right.
resistance. And I mean,
Right.
there were 5 levels of who is speaking and from what direction.
Right.
And I
Right.
think that was more of his experience of what is the truth here? Because
Right.
we are in this clandestine society that is, POWs. And
Right.
then there's the Nazis that at this point, in 1945, the commandants and the guards weren't really listening to the Nazi party because they didn't believe it at that point, and
Right.
they thought they
Right.
were losing. So
Right.
everything was really a shade of gray. Um,
Right.
and
Right.
the Americans looked like, as during this, for sure during the second forced march, it looked like the Americans were winning. And so the Germans were trying to buddy up with Americans to hope to get out with them.
Right.
So there was a lot going on that was just, all lines were not linear. It was just this
Right.
fusion and overlap.
Right.
So that was a lot of his experience of not locking down something, but allowing it to flow and see where the definitive end came.
Yeah, got from your one thing I got from your book that I hadn't fully realized before was the separation of officers from enlisted men and the different treatment, and as horrible as your dad's situation was, it I got the impression from reading it that the treatment of the enlisted men would be a lot less um, you know, brutal, if you will. They had some respect for the fact that a person was an officer.
Yes,
Um,
I think especially in 13D, there was like officers' row, and they were more
right,
like townhouses than barracks.
right, and there's a World War I classic French movie about um, aviators, and the way the aviators respected each other no matter what. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I have seen some from World War I, which the kind of wooden planes that were wired together were shocking.
Yeah, but there's one about prisoners it'll come to me. I've had
Okay.
COVID brain on top of aging brain, and sometimes. It's all in there, but sometimes it takes a while to get it out.
Yeah.
Um, if you haven't seen that movie,
Okay, I gotta
really
see that.
interesting because one thing that happens is that, you know, a plane comes down in enemy territory and the guys are captured by the, you know, the other side, and they all go out drinking. They're sort of drinking together, and there's a great camaraderie between aristocratic people, no matter what side they're on, because they know each other, and you know, the dukes and the this and that of European. Victoria's people married Germans, and you know, so there's this sort of loyalty of that social group, and there was an immense loyalty towards aviators. You know, it's
Mhm.
like we're all aviators, and doesn't matter what country we come from. We know that we know the dangers, we know the thrills, we know the, you know, the perspectives from up there, etc. So I don't think that carried into World War II. I'm sure the, you know, there was plenty of
Well, I
brutality,
do
but
think World War II was an aerial war. That's how they were going to win it.
yeah,
And because the German Air Force, it's not wasn't called the Air Force, but the German planes were so, that's what Dad kept talking about, was how really excellently engineered the German planes were.
right, right,
They
right.
were much more adept, and
E-
yeah.
Everything the Germans made was, I mean, that's one thing that shocked my father a lot, and a lot of medical people. The German science was revered internationally. People would want to go do a year in Germany for certain techniques or knowledge. So there was a lot of respect for that, and that those people could do what they did was shocking to a lot of people. Like for my dad, instruments and scientific research and those sort of things. In the 20s and 30s, people would look to Germany for the latest findings or the latest techniques in certain practices. So the attitudes, the international attitudes, it's like looking to France for fashion, if you will. I
Yeah,
mean, there were
yeah.
certain associations that internationally drew respect from certain segments of society. So it was hard after the, I don't know about your dad, but my sister and I learned really quickly nothing made in Germany could be in our house. I mean, my dad would go through the roof if he turned something over that my mother brought home that was made in Germany. One Christmas, she gave him a black leather coat, you know, black leather jacket. And he, you know, he almost viscerally recoiled from it because of SS. I mean,
Yeah,
there were
right.
some of these post-war, what he finally bought a Toyota. He didn't have the same feeling about Japan because he didn't have any personal contact, and he cared for German. So the paradox was he cared for German prisoners. The American hospitals had a section for German prisoners. If they could capture or have German medical personnel, that's who took care of them. If not, the Americans took care of them. And I asked my dad about that. He said, you know, they were patients. It didn't matter what nationality. When you were a doctor then, or a dentist, or you know, a head and neck surgeon, you took care of all your patients. You gave them all the same care. Um, and in the memoirs that some of the unit people wrote about, they were having dinner next to German prisoners who were officers. So there's some things that are difficult to comprehend, but that recoil that my dad had, that was due to his experience, and there were other things that were due to his experience that I didn't realize at first, but in retrospect, I know now came out of that experience.
That's one thing
Um,
I had to grapple with a little bit. We always had a Volkswagen van. Now, there
yeah,
were 9 children, so there are
yeah,
11 of us
yeah,
to move around. It
yeah,
was big, but it was always a Volkswagen. You could have gotten a car, like that, a different type.
yeah,
But I think it's that he recognized their expert in engineering and
yeah,
respected
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. I
Uh,
know.
and
Uh,
and
It,
the one time that he really freaked out in telling was when he saw the Tiger tank. He said
yeah.
that was really frightening.
You
Uh,
you said that in the book, and you know
yeah,
what I noticed? Are you an Apple person?
yeah.
How long have you been an Apple person?
From the beginning, I had the very first little boxy one
Yes,
in
80,
80 something.
85 for me, the year I
Yeah.
graduated from law school. But did you notice that the operating systems of Apple were named? There were the Panthers, there was something else, there was the
Oh,
Tiger. They were
yeah.
named, they were named for German. I realized at some point they were named for German tanks. Now, who snuck that in? I don't know. Do you remember
Yeah.
those years?
I do remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
if you go back and look at those operating systems, somebody was sitting beside in front of a desk or screen in Apple, and they had to have snuck those in,
Yeah.
um,
Because
because
that would be not the whole bite of the apple kind of idea.
yeah, whatever it is. And now it's geographic, because I'm an Apple person too. Now it's what, I don't know, they name them after mountains or
Yeah, mountain ranges. Um, right. Big Sur is
yeah,
one
right,
that, yeah.
right. It's just geographic landmarks, but yeah, you go back and look, there was a
Interesting.
tiger's operating system. Yeah,
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, so
yeah,
that was intimidating. And then he was even more intimidated by seeing the marching soldiers. That was worse than seeing the tank. This is when he's on the
yeah,
ground. And
yeah,
he said the look in their eyes was so mechanical, and the way they marched was so loud and not human. They were just one body, but it was hundreds of men.
right.
And I think now we know that at that point Hitler was giving them meth, and that stare that he talked about in their
Really?
eyes. Yeah, that is what he would give the men. It just came out a couple years ago.
Yeah,
And he was in later in life, and this came out in the French movie about how somebody was able to stop him from invading Paris and blowing up the river in Paris.
right. Is
Um,
Paris burning or
Something like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
That came out a few years ago too. But especially at the end of the war, the commandants weren't really listening to Hitler because they think he had fried his brain on some drug.
well, my dad wrote about, I mean, people thought my dad was a little off the charts, but he wrote about hypnosis, and he compared the reactions to those in a house of worship where there's incense and swinging uh
We do that in
censers.
Catholic Mass. Yeah.
Yeah,
Swing
yeah.
incense and go
and
through the
and
aisles.
music, and he thought there must have been some kind of hypnotic attempt to have those people in those armies do what they did. But I I don't know. The thing is, it bothered him till the end of his life that people could behave like that towards people. I mean, it was just something that was so against his core that that he never got over being part of that and seeing our soldiers so mangled, and because that's what he got the head and neck. He was
Yeah.
a we we had scrapbooks. They lived in Evanston because he got his postdoc
Oh,
surgical at Northwestern. He was
okay.
he and my mother were there for 2 or 3 years, on and off while he was in the National Guard, and he was getting his degree. Um, and that's why he ended up in a hospital unit. So he saw all the, the facial and upper body injuries besides being a dentist. And the
Well,
other
I
thing
think we're
is,
seeing a similar brutality now with the violence in cities, or with the violence of gangs, that
yeah,
they're given meth and then they go and do something they couldn't do without it.
well,
It gives them a,
our guys were always afraid they were getting saltpeter in their food, and apparently there was something to that. So
it
salt
was,
salt saltpeter,
oh,
it's
I don't
it's
know what that is.
it's anti-sexual.
Oh,
Yeah. So armies aren't above eh, that's just what it was called at the time. I don't know. And then it was used globally, generically.
uh,
But uh, I, certainly our soldiers were given stimulants, pilots were given stimulants, um, whether it was clandestinely or not. But I mean, Germany wouldn't be the only country to use substances to affect performance in their troops. Saltpeter's Saltpeter, and it's just a generic. There is actually a product called that, but it's also used globally for products that suppress sexual longings, performance,
uh,
etc. So I've read accounts where people suspected that maybe, they were being given something.
so that I read a Patton book, and
Yeah.
part of his training was to make sure the men forgot about their girlfriends at home and their mothers at home and their wives at home. And so he was putting down females so that they could go into the Battle of the Bulge and shoot a person. And what it said in this account was that it lasted about a week, and then they would shoot over the heads of people. So all of that training, all that caused misogyny in, to all of these 18 and 25-year-old men, was all good for a week or two of making a soldier. And then they couldn't look in the eye of another person and shoot them. So, but all Patton's job was to, without medication, to get
Well,
his soldiers to act that
if,
way.
if they got mad enough, they could. I mean, remember the books about Okinawa and the
Oh
books we
yeah,
read in
brutal.
Japan. In Japan, certainly they were capable of slaughter, even of prisoners, because they saw what was done to them and their buddies, and
Yeah, with the
um,
old breed was
yeah,
so specific.
yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
and I found the HBO series about it that I had a harder time watching it than I did reading
yeah,
it.
yeah, because they're, all ethical, um, all ethical, religious teachings aside, there's some sort of tribal instinct. The Germans are closer to us as an army, not individually, than the people of the South Pacific or something. There was an ability to, I don't know. There was just something that there were some barriers that were down, I think, when those books we read um, you know, were being written, or the understanding of what happened.
Yeah, it took the soldiers a long time to be able to write it, to be able to recall it.
Yeah, or to confess. Well, it's almost like confessing it. Or
Yeah.
I just read we were, or did I read or see? We Were Soldiers. Did you ever see that movie?
No,
It's about Vietnam and the people who wrote later about um, their experiences. It's probably on Netflix or someplace, but
okay.
it's very brutal, and there's a part of it that's about delivering those letters that your um, grandmother got.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the story of one guy who was the head of a unit, and it follows the unit through the different stages of the Vietnamese War. Um, but there's something in common in all wars. They're all different, but there's something in common because it comes down to behaviors that um, that are unacceptable in under other circumstances. I mean, it goes
And
against,
reactions too to
yeah,
what
yeah,
happened. Yeah.
everything you've been taught. I mean, so
Yeah. So my nephew was in Afghanistan for couple years, and he said he did have to go out on occasion, which we were always nervous about, to patrol or something like that.
yeah,
But he
yeah,
said basically it was a lot of paperwork. And that's
yeah,
what we are finding is gold, is all the paperwork that someone sat there and jotted down notes.
right,
Because they can't remember. They're drilled so much, they're headed somewhere, somebody's telling them what to do, and you have to kind of shut down the, I feel like getting up and doing this today thing. You have to get up and follow directions
yeah,
for the whole time. So you're not really thinking in a way of, this is my life and I'm going to recall it. You're thinking in a way of, I've got to be ready for what the next direction is, and I have to follow it so that everybody is safer.
yeah,
So having it all jotted down is really the treasure for us, because they couldn't be in a mindset to remember it for many
right.
reasons.
But it has an order to it, and I've gone to a lot of conferences, and the- often the panel, when asked questions, they'll look at each other and say, the fog of war, or something like that. Because when it's all neatly written down, it's often not the reality. It's often, there's a bit of panic, there's a bit of spacey, just to putting it putting part of you of what you think of as the behavior you'd engage in, sectioning that off, and then using another part of your brain to do what you got to do. I i don't know, I've never been able to come to grips with that. But the aviator drops a bomb from above. The foot soldier is looking at the
Right.
people on the road fleeing, the bodies, it's just a different,
Mhm.
it's the same old, but it's from a different place.
Yeah.
um
And that's where Eugene Sledge in with the old guard, he had a doctor's training to write down specifically his observations. And he
yeah,
had a Bible, and he
right,
kept doing it every day.
right,
And, he couldn't look at it for many years, but that observation and that detail that he gave it. I remember Jay Winter saying, this is the best document of a soldier's life in World War II,
yeah, yeah,
because of that specificity. And that for him, it was, this is the thing that calms me down, to
yeah,
be able
but
to
this,
write this down. If
this
anybody ever finds this, if I don't make it, but if I do make it, I've got this record. But he needed to write it down for his own sanity, I think.
Right, but he was also in, like mano a mano
Yeah.
war. There
Oh,
wasn't distance that you can fill with other thoughts. I used to teach medical ethics, and we do philosophers and whatever. But I said, as far as I'm concerned, there's just the dining room test. When you're home with your family and your, Aunt Susie turns to you and say, well, what are you doing, John, now in medical school? And if you can't tell her, then you got to start thinking about ethics, because there was a time in the last 20 years when in the operating rooms, medical students would be encouraged to do some of the examinations to practice, like anesthetized women would be given pelvics. The head surgeon might say, now's your chance to try a pelvic. You want to go, things like that and it's in the literature. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not fantasizing or anything. It's in the literature. And we would do simulations about how would you respond if you're being asked to do that? How would you feel? So we had to personalize it. We had to make them, if this were your girlfriend, undergoing throat surgery, and you knew that people were not only given permission, but encouraged to do this, would you participate, or would you say, I'm sorry, that's, so what you do in war, instead of personalizing things, you depersonalize things.
Right.
It was sort of the opposite, but it's like the famous case where Supreme Court justices were asked, what is obscenity? How are you going to rule on a case that something was obscene or not? And the judge said, you'll know it when you see it. And it's the same thing with a medical ethics crisis. And it's the same thing with the wartime ethics crisis. But in the war, you got to do it.
And somehow your supervisor has to get you to do it.
Right, unless it's unless it's clearly a violation of something. You don't have to, supposedly you don't have to follow an illegal or an impermissible order, but determining at the last minute in front of Patton will get you shot if you
right.
if you don't do it, or slap you around, or do whatever Patton did.
Definitely humiliate you. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, permanently or not.
Yeah, but you think of how many men he trained who were very young in their lives, and what they came home with that training. So yeah, it's a very tricky thing. I have so many thoughts from what you were saying. They're all just jumbled up all of a sudden.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's not that people never have to face, I don't know what else is comparable. It's not that people never have to face ethical crises on important actions, but what can I say?
Yeah, and the thing that was in Patton's book was they have to listen to you because they don't know what you're doing. They don't know what the Battle of the Bulge. We're all going north and east, and all of a sudden we're turning. And if everybody there questions, what are you doing? This isn't the direction we're supposed to go in.
Oh, yeah.
Then it's a big problem.
Right,
so
yeah.
It's like you just have to say, everybody turn right. And he's got to move these, hundreds of men to turn right. So he's got to have all his subordinates do the same thing without questioning.
Well, so, you're a mom. I mean, there's certain things like, I mean, I was pretty liberal with my kids, but running into the street without stopping and looking.
Yeah, we had that magic square. You have to stop at the magic square, and then you can start deciding which way you're going to go from there.
Yeah, you have to look, but so it's writ large and much more dangerously. But I don't think there's too much trouble with that part of the, once the drill sergeants get them prepped, and I think instinctively they follow orders.
Yeah.
The the people who have other sets of ethics, like the medical people, that's something entirely different,
Mhm.
because my dad had, you know, medical ethics, and that when there was a conflict of ethics between the army and medical ethics in dealing with something, he would go with the medical ethics.
Mhm. That makes sense because
Um,
he's got the Hippocratic Oath that he had to.
well, no, because he wasn't an MD, but there were certain principles. If the army said you're only using this substance to treat this problem, and my dad had a patient who he thought, should be treated differently per his training and per the patient's interest, he would do what was in the patient's interest, because a battle didn't depend upon it or
Yeah.
whatever. And I know this because I got those reports from St. Louis. So I got the reports on my father's behavior that were in his army record. And at the very end, I mean, I'll see if I can send you. And there, the head of the hospital also had to rate the people's intelligence.
Oh,
A,
and that
B,
gets back
C,
to that. Oh boy.
and then following orders. So this was the colonel at the head of the hospital rating his people. So I think I had 3 reports of that. And with each report, my dad got a little more intelligent for the guy. And the final one, he was tops in intelligence, and there was a little narrative that said, he's a superb surgeon, and he has excellent training and medical judgment, but he does not do well at following orders.
Because
That's
he's
what it
taking
says.
care of his patient, not his.
The smarter he got, the apparently.
Yeah.
So, and I remember he said we were doing fine. We'd all been together for a year and a half, and we'd come to Europe together, and we'd set up the hospital together, and we built this, and we did that. And then they put this they put this general in charge of us, and he didn't know shit from Shinola, was what he said. And none of us were going to do, what he ordered us to do, because it was not in the best interest of, whatever. So I don't know. So um,
Yeah.
I'm, I just want to write down what I've said I would
Oh
send
yeah,
you.
I'd like to St. Louis and the um
Tim
St. Louis
Mulligan, Tim
Tim
Mulligan's
Mulligan's.
contacts, but
Yeah.
look him up, and before, and you'll see the books he wrote. He was the go-to guy
At
in
Nara.
in the archives for German submarines, and he wrote a book about that, and a lot, and just World War II in general. He wrote the book on organizing. The I'll send the details. So
Okay,
he was
thank
the
you so much.
archivist. Yeah, he knew where all the bodies were, literally where all the bodies were hidden. And that French movie that you've just got to see.
Yeah,
Because it's in the history of aviation, it
the
shows
prisoners
something.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah, it shows the camaraderie between classes in World War I, which,
The other thing I found is on Memorial Day, I'll often just start doing research on the internet because a lot of things are freed up that
free,
day.
fold 3.
I'm not sure what fold 3 is.
Fold 3 is an military database that you have to pay to use, and on holidays they usually give you 24 hours. And
Yes.
they've
And
got a
that's
huge, it's like Ancestry. I mean, they've got a huge database of military information.
yes, I think that's what I've happened upon. And I've seen
Yeah,
so many images of what it was like to be in a B-17 at the time that I could really
yeah,
feel it. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I went to an estate sale around here and I bought a big box of paper and notebooks and things just for the paper.
Mhm.
And when I, how they have like $5 and,
Yeah.
just, um, and when I got home, at the bottom of it was World War II airplane navigator. And there were
Wow.
some some of his papers. He wasn't in Germany like your dad. He was on the South Pacific Islands, and he
Uh-huh.
participated in the Nagasaki raid, which
Wow.
was the day after the Hiroshima raid. And he wrote a little bit about what it was like to be in the air. He prepared a speech for a reunion.
Uh-huh.
And I also found most of that was just copies of things that he was preparing for a reunion,
Uh-huh.
handouts, and so it wasn't anything personal. But there was also a Loran map that he used to plot their flights,
Amazing.
and he had a silk map
Yeah.
that I have.
I'm
And
so glad that fell into your hands. You know what to do with
well,
it.
I wanted it to fall out of my hands, and I wanted it to be in a collection, you
Hmm.
know, and I wanted it to be in Dayton at the Air Force, where they have the yearly Air Air Force meetings with old planes. Have you ever been to that?
I haven't been to it, but once again, last year I booked going in a B-17.
Yeah,
And I just talked to the wife of a pilot of one of those who used to fly out of Kenosha, and they had
right.
a crash and they lost 8 people and they're not doing it any longer.
Oh, it was the southern air. Uh, some of those old planes were
Yeah.
rebuilt with
So yeah, and they have one in Michigan that flies all the time. You could
the
go anywhere.
Confederate. It was the Confederate Air Force or something. The guys called themselves, and they restored these old planes. But anyway, there's a museum there in Dayton of the Air Force. So I called them up and said, I have a small collection, but it's from a very important action, and I'm interested in donating it.
Uh-huh.
And she said, well, send me, she said, I'm the gateway. A committee meets periodically, and I have to decide what to offer to the committee um, for acceptance. And we don't accept everything. You can imagine we get all
Yeah.
kinds of offers, and only certain things are really interesting. So I said, okay, I'll send you, pictures and tell you what I have. I said, it's a navigator of one of the I think it was a B-17 that went on the flight to Nagasaki. So I put a package together and I sent it to her, and she said no, you know,
Oh, yeah.
and and I said, well, can you tell me who the committee members are? I thought, you know, sometimes you have some gatekeeper who is not with the program,
Mhm.
you know, doesn't really understand the import of things. And so she wouldn't tell me who they
Oh,
were.
yeah.
And I thought, oh, well, maybe she won't be here next year. So I tried again the following year, no interest. So I have a friend, because I thought that's where it belonged.
Mhm.
Um, so I have a friend who works at, are we out of time? You said 40 minutes or,
The phone's ringing, so I've muted myself.
oh,
Um,
no, yeah, to answer your
so,
phone call. But I,
no, I'll get that later. So yeah,
but
we're
I,
beyond 40 minutes, but this is fascinating. I think on Sunday, they must let me go for longer than 40 minutes.
okay.
So, and this
So,
has been so great that I kind of kept it rolling.
yeah, well, Thanks. So,
Yeah,
yeah, we could talk forever, I guess.
I know. There's so
We should
much.
be sitting in, what's that coffee place in New Haven? That,
Yeah.
not Claire's, but the non.
Common ground, I think.
No, it's the one that probably wasn't, it's closer to the art museum. It's right on the same street as Claire's, and it's a
Yeah.
big coffee shop and a bookshop.
Mhm.
So
So
anyway,
also the Yale Center for British Art, they said we
yes,
already have a silk map of Germany, so we don't need
really,
another one. You know, it's like
yeah,
the encyclopedic places, they just need one.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a friend that I know pretty well, and her significant other, they've been together for decades, but he's just, anyway, he works at NASA. He works for the Air and Space Museum, and he wrote a book, kind of like you. He wrote a book about animals in planes. So
Ah,
he took all the pictures from guys in biplanes with little dogs next to them, and
oh yeah.
and goggles, and so anyway, and he still works there. So I told her, and then the next time he was there, I told him. He said that would be perfect for us. Why don't you donate it? So same story. I called them and they weren't interested. So I told him at the annual Christmas party we all go to, and he said, well, you know, don't talk on the phone, write a letter. So I did that, and I never got an answer to that either. So I don't want these things in my house. I think they're significant and they should be in
Yeah.
other hands. That's what I
Taken
mean.
care of. I agree with you. Yeah.
The other thing I have is, I don't know if your dad used this. It's called LORAN. It's long range. Um, it's really radar. It was early radar, and the aviators had LORAN maps, LORAN, and they could use that to plot their voyages by these radar signals. And I think that belongs, I went, I don't know, Margot, I'm sorry, what am I saying? No, I don't know, but it's hard to give things away. I mean, Yale was great with the postcards because Mike was interested in these things, but I wanted to give something to the Beinecke, and the woman said, is this part of a collection or is this a single item? And I said, this is a single item. And she said, we just want collections because
Mhm.
single items get lost in collections like ours. So
Uh,
I don't know if that's the case.
well,
but
maybe it's put it up for auction, and if somebody pays for it, they'll take care of it.
Yeah, but I don't want to do it. That's just another person in private hands like
Yeah.
me.
Hmm.
I'd like these things to be available to a researcher, because
Right. Yeah.
like you, now that you've been immersed in all that research, I mean, you want something there for you to research. Sooner or later, someday, somebody's going to be interested in somebody's house. You know, my kids would probably throw up their arms in despair and get a dumpster and just, you know,
Yeah, and part of it is I agree with you. Like I've gotten this far into it. I should make sure all of the important things are taken care of. So it's
yes,
not putting it on my kids to do the same thing a
right.
generation later.
Right. Also, we could have a whole discussion about this, but also in my family, which is very small and limited. I mean, there are four grandchildren and three great grandchildren from my father, plus my generation. My sister, and who's deceased, and her children. So uh, there were some things of his that I thought should be available to all. I didn't want to give it to one child or
Yeah.
another child.
Right. Yeah.
I wanted it in an institution where if they were interested, they could all access it.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then let everybody know where it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and without going into detail, I mean, one thing that triggered the research was my finding films of my father's surgeries in Paris.
Wow.
Yeah, and I live near, I very rich in research sources here. I live near the National Library of Medicine,
Mm.
and I asked around, and I finally got referred to an archivist, and she was really interested in that, and she took the films for the collection and gave me DVD copies.
Oh,
So
that's great.
that's great, but if you went to look for them, it's so the research is so complex that you really have to ask a research librarian to find them for you. But
So did your father train in Europe and then come back and get the degree?
No, my father, went to Philadelphia and he trained at Temple and
In
then
surgery,
in dentistry.
dentistry. Okay.
And he got his dental degree, and his intention in peacetime then was to get his MD degree and do head and neck surgery. He
Oh,
wanted to fix things, jaws,
yeah.
he so the war interrupted that. So he did his dental degree, he completed that. And at Temple at the time, all your pre-med and pre-dents were trained together. So they had all the
Okay.
basic chemistry and anatomy and, dissection, and they had the same courses. So it was easy sort of to tack on the other degree. If you got one, it was just a year or two to get
Okay.
the other degree, dental or medicine. They didn't specialize till the end of the basics. So he was in the National Guard, and then he went to Evanston to do the head and neck. It wasn't an MD program, it was a postdoc master's in the specialty of head and neck surgery.
Mm-hmm.
So there were about 8 graduates in his program there. So he was prepped to do, and then he did an internship in New York City in head and neck surgery.
All before he went to Europe.
All before he went to Europe.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. All
So
before
he was years ahead of my dad as far as education.
Oh, he was much older. He was
Yeah.
older than, than your dad. My dad was born in 1915.
And dad was 21.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a different
Yeah.
generation.
Although
Although your dad
just
was
those
an
college
officer.
years. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the younger guys came in as, privates and then moved up. But your dad, I'm not sure, what
He started off a lieutenant because he was in the Navy first. When he moved
Right.
to the Army, he was automatically a lieutenant.
Yeah.
And then he was in charge of his troop when he was in Pennsylvania. And then, and he had already flown a plane, but he said it was all tests and math the whole time. His training was tests and math. Must have
Right.
been an Enigma code kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so in all that testing, they determined he had a very good spatial intelligence. And
Right.
his job was to get the plane back if all the radar and control panels went down. He could
Right.
look at
Right.
they weren't flying at night, but he was really adept at stars and location on, with the sun and all of those.
Yeah,
kind of
navigation, celestial navigation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which they
So
don't
anyway,
teach.
I'm taking up a lot of your time, but I've loved it. It's been so
Yeah,
great
you
to catch
too.
up and compare
Yeah.
notes.
Yeah.
And I also love that we have this little gem of ours. So thank you.
Yeah.
This recording that we can.
Oh, the recording.
I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thanks. Let's keep in touch.
Yeah.
I'll stop this for now. I'll capture this again.
Yeah. He and my Aunt Pearl had a sewing machine business with the fabric business. And all I remember is Uncle Jack was in a little back room and he repaired sewing machines. So I don't know if it was his the kind of precision and radar training and technical ability that you're talking about that, you know, it was like plowshares, changing the swords into plowshares.
Yeah.
His swords were, the navigation and the development of radar, and the plowshares were, having a growing family with my Aunt Pearl and repairing sewing machines. So,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
but
Amazing.
but
It was a training of sorts and not exactly the same of, going through the usual American pattern. That's why this generation is, I think, is so fascinating.
Yeah,
They were trained in a different way.
your dad didn't change careers though. He was.
No, he was a well, slightly. He was a cartoonist before the war, and he was he sent the cartoons back to a magazine in Chicago. So he was a correspondent while he was in POW camp. And then he came back and became an artist reporter, much more capturing historic moments.
Oh, right. Like when cameras weren't permitted in a courtroom, he did the drawing, that sort of thing.
So he covered the Emmett Till trial for Life magazine. And 4 months later, Rosa Parks wouldn't get up from her seat in the back of the bus. She was already in the black section, but she wouldn't get up.
So he's at the heart of all these iconic events in American history. Yeah.
And he just kept dropping down right into the middle of them over and over and over again.
Like parachuting it.
Yeah, the parachuting artist. Exactly. Wherever there was trouble, he was there.
Oh, God, yeah. Social instead of martial. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also it probably is Stalag 3, well, also being in Chicago, that was much more integrated before he went off to war. It was segregated after World War II.
Yeah, because it was a refuge for the Southern, Black people to go north to Chicago.
Yeah, and that first was named during the migration in the 30s, or the 20s, 1919 around. That was called the Black Belt, and then it became called Bronzeville by a Tribune reporter. But that was not really a refuge. It was really a pretty constricted area that they could live. So it was a lot of overcrowding. But I think my guess is that his time at Stalag 3, where they had the Tuskegee Airmen and people from all over the world, not that each barrack seemed to be, US, Australian, French, but he was in that camp and on those marches with people from all over the world. And also the Tuskegees were there, the Lost Airmen of Buchenwald were there at the same time.
I don't know. No.
So that is a group that got captured and was put into a Jewish concentration camp and talked their way out and were sent by the skin of their teeth to Stalag 3. So they must have told some stories about what was going on. But for the most part, both mom and dad said they knew nothing about what was happening. They just knew what their jobs were for the war effort, and they had no idea about the concentration camps during that time.
Well, the Black segregation, when the memoirs of the people, when they wrote about building a hospital in Normandy, they said, we're camped here and across from us are the Black troops. So, and the jobs that they had a separate dental clinic with a Black dentist, because when I went to the archives for pictures, I got this picture and it was a Black dentist treating a Black person, and another picture, obviously the exact same room, everything was in the same place, with a white dentist treating white patients. So that the Army was hugely segregated. The graves details. It wasn't just that, you know, the segregated troops were asked to serve, you know, be the cooks and servers and things like that. They also got graves details, um, burials, reinterments, and sending people home. Um,
Oh, how awful.
they got some fun things. There's something called the Red Ball Express. Do you know the Red Ball?
No.
It was a corps of supply trucks with incredibly skilled drivers, and the route went past Paris, um, and they were supplying Patton, who was, you know, running like a bunny across Europe, and a lot of those drivers were black drivers, you know, because they were given the heavy lifting kind of jobs. So it was a truly segregated military at the time, till Truman had the balls to, you know. Speaking of red balls, makes me think. But anyway, okay,
That's a story that hasn't been told enough, I don't think.
yeah. I don't know if there's right, you know, right after the war, there were a lot of black and white movies about the different service people, like the CBs, and, you know, the guys you don't hear too much about. The CBs could build you an airport overnight, you know, for planes and in the South Pacific, and they did construction. There were a lot. It's like the Monument Men. There were a lot of specialized
Mhm.
corps that were amazingly good at what they did. So okay.
All right.
So
Thank
maybe,
you.
yeah, maybe after all this sinks in, periodically we could touch base on